on Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, classes reading Asian literature, primarily Hindu and Sanskrit literature in Sanskrit, Tibetan, and Pali languages. Professor Lang finished her PhD at the University of Virginia and spent her career, at the University of Washington, spent her career at the University of Virginia, where she also began to take interest and write about issues centered around women and gender and women in Buddhism in particular. I teach, many of you know, I teach a class on women in Buddhism here, and this set of classes we're just so happy to be able to give here at Utah State to focus on women in religion. And everything I know about women in Buddhism, I've, one way or another, I've learned from Professor Lang, who's been my own teacher in graduate school, and so I'm very just happy to have her here to talk about a very interesting and important topic. So with that, I'd just like to let Professor Lang and enjoy.
Okay, one thing I want to say right here at the beginning is if you have a question when I'm discussing something, go ahead and ask it then, before you forget it. I'm also really keen on images. I'm going to pass some around in addition to showing some on the screen. The first three of these are images of female divinity. And the latter of these are women from a place I know very well in northern India, just outside of Dharamsala, where His Holiness the Dalai Lama has his headquarters, which is a fantastic nunnery. And so you'll see some pictures taken mostly by a photographer I know, who's terrific. And so you'll see some of these images of nuns, what they do. One of these images, you'll see them sort of facing off. One of the ways that these nuns learn about their tradition is to debate it. They take two sides, they change sides, and they really get an idea of what things are about by debating it, with one another. So you'll see that in these pictures. So I'll just pass these around too. All right, what I'm going to talk about is women in Buddhism. Nuns, lay women, start out at the beginning and move on up to the present. Needless to say, I'm not going to talk about everything in Buddhist history, but I'm going to try and hit some of the highlights. Okay. All right. Well, how did Buddhism? Because of one very persistent woman. This was a woman whose name is called Mahaprajapati. You have to remember that. Sometimes she's referred to as Gautami, which is by her clan name. She is the woman who raised the Buddha after his mother passed away after his birth. So there's a close family relationship. After her husband, the king, passed away, what she wanted to do with her life was to become a close follower of her adopted son, the Buddha, and to follow him around and listen to his teachings. She wanted to become more than just an average follower. She wanted to achieve the same status as his male followers, those who had become disciples, those who had become monks, bhikkhu. And when she asked him about it, he said, "You're welcome to follow me around, listen to my teachings," but he declined to establish a separate order for women, equal to that of the men. And that distressed her, but she determined to continue to follow him around, listen to the teachings, asked him a second time, asked him a third time, and still he declined. Another member of his family, one of his cousins, Ananda, he comes across Gautami and she's sitting down on a rock and she's weeping. And he comes to her and he asks her, what's wrong? What's the problem? And she says to him, "I asked the Buddha if I could become a nun, a bhikkhuni, a fully fledged member of the order, and he turned me down. And Ananda is known in this tradition for having a really warm heart, very compassionate. He sees that she's in pain, and he resolves to do something about it. So he goes to the Buddha, and he says, this is what I've heard from Gautami. She says you're not willing to establish an order for women equal to that of the men. And the Buddha said, yes, that's the way it had happened. And then Ananda begins to make his arguments. The first argument he makes is an intellectual argument. He says, certainly you believe that women have as much capacity as men to meditate, to understand the teachings, to become enlightened. And the Buddha says, yes, I believe that. I teach that. But that wasn't enough of an argument to get the Buddha to consent to form an order for women. So what Ananda does is he makes an emotional argument. And he makes it very personal. He says to the Buddha, think back to your childhood. Who was the woman who brought you up, who nourished you, who gave you milk from her own breast? I mean, that's a very intimate, personal argument. And the Buddha conceded that he had been nourished and brought up by Gautami. And those two arguments together were what finally convinced him to say, yes, I will enable her to join the order. At this time, it was very informal. All he had to say was, come here, monk, come here, bhikkhuni. It wasn't a formalized ordination process as it's become now. So he allows her to come. She brings with her a number of her attendants. Some of the texts get really elaborate. They say she brought 500 women into the order. Maybe 500 is just a way of saying a lot of women. These were women who had become widowed, who really didn't have much of a stake in society once they'd become widowed. Some of them are women whose husbands had left them, some to join the order. So this gave these women a place where they could bond together to form a community of their own, based not just on blood ties, but on a shared appreciation of the desire to learn and to experience what the Buddha had to offer. So for the time of that period when she persisted, she could have given up, but she kept on going back. And finally, she was allowed to form an order. What you see in this image, it's a silk tapestry from Dunhuang, one of the oases on the Silk Route. You see the process of nuns here shaving the heads of young women and initiating them into the order of female monastics. All right. One of the things that is striking about the Buddhist tradition is that it preserves in its canon a number of poems that are written by women. There's a great new translation of this by someone Dominic has studied with, Charles Halsley, which he translates all of their sayings. Sometimes when you see in a distance a monastic coming, it's very difficult to tell the gender of that person because they have the same shaven head, they're wearing the same loose garments. It's only when you get up closer and you see women generally have smaller statures that you can really tell this is a woman coming or this is a man coming. But what's interesting also about the tradition, it preserves different sayings. Both of these monastics are talking about their experiences. The first one is that of a nun. Second is that of a monk. And you can see the sort of gendered by the kinds of things they talk about. The woman says, I'm free, I'm liberated. I'm free from three crooked things. The mortar, the pestle. Traditionally, the woman's role is in the kitchen. In India, you grind the spices daily, make them nice and fresh. And my hunchbacked husband. This probably was not a love marriage. But none of those things are part of her life now. Everything that dragged her back, that kept her from what she wanted to do, which was to follow the Buddha and listen to his teachings, all of that has been cut. There's a similar poem from a male. And he says, I'm free for three crooked things: sickles, plows, curved spade. In other words, he was a farmer, and that's the work that he was doing. And he says, enough of them. Meditate, remain vigilant. So he's given up his previous life for a life of a monastic. This is another nun who talks about her background. India was a very hierarchical society. Men were on top, but even among men, there was hierarchy in terms of your birth. If you were born into a priestly class, you were born into a royal class, born into a class of merchants and farmers, or born into a laborer, that's where you stood in relation to society. This woman is somebody who we might say is a slave. She says, I'm a water carrier. She goes down to the water in the cold. She's afraid of her mistress's anger, abuse, and she sees this high-caste Brahmin priest. She says to him, what are you afraid of when you go down to the water? Why are your limbs shaking from the cold? What she's referring to is this practice of high-caste Brahmins going down and bathing in holy rivers, like the sacred river Ganges. They go down first thing in the morning, they bathe, they give a ritual salutation to the sun, and it's cold in the morning there. So this definitely has the ring of true experience. Because this Brahmin believes that this is a holy river, he believes that by washing in it, he's washing away his sins. And this woman, who was once a water carrier, says to him, what ignorant person told you that whoever does something wrong is saved by washing away in water? How can the waters of this holy Ganga wash away your sins? And she makes it even more stark. If it were true that water could wash away your sins, then all of the frogs, turtles, alligators, crocodiles, all of them would go to heaven. So she's really making fun of this elite member of society. She says even people like people who kill sheep, pigs, fishermen, animal trappers, thieves, executioners. It's true that this water of the river Ganges will wash away your sins. Even these people will be free of their evil actions. So what I like about this poem is it really shows that somebody who's at the bottom of society, somebody who was a slave, who becomes liberated from that status once she joins the Buddhist order, it gives her confidence to speak up, even to somebody at the highest level of society. This is another verse that has a woman being confronted by Mara. Mara is kind of like a Satan figure. He's a tempter. He confronted the Buddha, tried to dissuade him from following his path to liberation. He sent his sons and daughters to tempt the Buddha into giving up. But he comes himself right in front of these women, including this one, whose name is Soma. And he tries to dissuade her from following the Buddhist path. And what she says to him is, what does it matter if I'm a woman? If I have a mind that's well composed, if I have achieved knowledge, if I've got insight, if I've destroyed any attachment to sensual pleasure, darkness is broken through. There's no more darkness of ignorance. You're defeated, Mara, Lord Death. I have triumphed over her. And what you see is this is a panel from this lovely Buddhist monument that was put up at the highest peak in Thailand. There are two of these monuments. One was put up by the king, one by the queen. And the queen dedicated hers to these women who had followed the Buddha and become enlightened. Yeah, all of these panels are in shades of pink and purple, which I found kind of surprising. But they're gorgeous. And they celebrate these women who were the first of the Buddha's disciples and who followed his path and became enlightened individuals. One of the key issues for these women was getting men to teach them. Women could teach women, and women very often did teach other women, pass on the knowledge. The standard that they use is, who can I trust? Who can I trust to pass on this knowledge to me without leaving anything behind? The choice of a leader is often based on seniority, and the senior-most members of the community of monks and nuns were in fact the monks. So the most senior leader would have been a male. And there's an interesting story in the Buddhist canon that talks about the fact that one of these monks who was supposed to be teaching the women, these nuns, really wasn't doing his job. They didn't feel they could have true confidence in them. But instead of sort of suffering in silence, these women went to the Buddha and they said, this guy is not doing his job. And he goes to this monk and he says, straighten up. It's your job to teach these women and give them everything you have to share. So I like the fact that these women's voices were not silenced. This is another of these sort of panels from that Buddhist monument on top of the mountain. It's kind of ironic that right next to these two beautiful Buddhist monuments is a sort of spy center where they've got all of this listening equipment high up on the mountain. Oops, okay, I guess this does work. All right, what about gendered religious roles? In some conservative communities, such as Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, there is a definite hierarchy. Men are at the top. They tend to officiate at religious ceremonies. If you have a state ceremony, it will primarily be men who are invited to preside. If you want to have a house blessed, if you want to have scriptures read on behalf of somebody who's sick, then you might call in a nun. What you see here are Burmese nuns. You can tell they're different in that they wear different robes. These nuns all happen to wear pink robes, whereas the men are wearing orange robes. And the reason they are lower in status is that the tradition of a full ordination for young women was not preserved. It somehow was broken off in the Middle Ages, whereas the nuns were somehow left behind. The men preserved their tradition, their lineage.
So you're saying in the Middle Ages, the order of nuns ceased.
That's what the tradition says about itself. Sometime around the 14th century, the nuns' order ceased to exist. Yes? I think the larger patriarchal culture had a lot to do with it. That men and women as well were more comfortable seeing women in the home bringing up the children, preparing the food, than they were seeing them as independent religious teachers.
But the power structure also is important, right? Because in traditional patriarchal cultures, particularly in Asia, there's a kind of power thing, right?
Oh, there's definitely a power thing.
Then entered into the religious tradition and then overtook that older tradition.
Right. Men never gave up their power willingly. And so, even in the beginning of this tradition's foundation, you had to have a man, Ananda, intercede on behalf of Gautama to get the Buddha to form an order of nuns. Yes? You know, I don't really know to that extent. I mean, I would think that something like the Black Death would have not discriminated on the basis of gender and taken equal numbers of men and women with it, but you're right. I mean, they would be in the role of nursing people who were sick, and that would leave them more likely to get infected. Yeah, that's something I have never thought about. It's something nobody I've read has ever thought about, but that's really an interesting thing to think about, that women's roles as nurses, it might have left them much more susceptible to dying off, literally. Yes?
It's so interesting about when this shift happened, whether coordination is suddenly overnight, because of course you probably know what happened recently with the nuns in the Polish tradition, right, where they actually were in Theravada tradition again to
It's been a real controversy. Because within the Theravada tradition, only in Sri Lanka, and again because there were some, in my view, progressive enlightened monks who agreed to ordain women, is there now full ordination in Sri Lanka. But not in other Theravada countries. And what happens when there's not full ordination in Theravada countries is that they can seek ordination from places like Hong Kong, from Korea, where there is a full ordination. This woman, Venerable Dhammananda, she was a professor at Harvard studying comparative religion. Her mother, who was ethnically Chinese, had become ordained in the Chinese nun tradition. And when her mother died, she took over her mother's temple. But she didn't want to become ordained in the Chinese tradition. She went to Sri Lanka and was ordained in the Theravada tradition in Sri Lanka. And she has been very outspoken about, she believes that Thailand should grant women the same opportunities men. And this is what she says. When women can't become ordained because the image of women is negative. I mean, there are a lot of scriptural passages in Buddhism that have very negative things to say about women's bodies. I mean, men tend to fear what is different from them. You see some of the same misogynist scriptures in other religious traditions as well. It pushes women, she says, to the other end of the spectrum. You know, she asks, why is the door of the brothels open to women? And why are the doors closed to women who want to become fully ordained? Female ordination, she says, is a right that the Buddha gave us. So what you see here, she has become fully ordained, but the other women surrounding her are wearing white clothes. And that indicates somebody who is a serious religious practitioner, but who hasn't become fully ordained. One of the arguments that men raise against full ordination is, well, there are more rules that women have to keep than men. How can you keep all 311 precepts? Well, men have some 200 precepts, and we can be sure they don't keep all of them either. But what she says is, I keep one basic precept. I watch my mind. That's enough. Shifting again to another fact of the tradition is most of the stories of the Buddha's previous lives, he was always male, with one notable exception. In all of these stories of the Buddha's previous lives, he was the key character in them. He was the one who exemplified generosity or compassion. And here you see the Buddha sacrificing himself to a hungry tigress. It was painted by a Tibetan artist who clearly had never seen a tiger in his life. But we have many different collections of stories about the Buddha's past life. And one of them, he manifests as a woman whose name is Rupavati. It means literally somebody who's possessed of beauty. But she also exemplifies compassion. She sees a woman who is starving and who cannot feed her children. And what she does is she cuts off her own breast and gives it to this woman who's starving so that she can feed her own child. And in these stories, there's an act of truth. May I educate those who are uneducated, liberate those who aren't liberated, comfort those who need comforting, and bring to nirvana those who haven't attained nirvana. By the words of truth, may the bodily faculties of a woman disappear from me, and may I appear with the bodily faculties of the mind. This is also, a somewhat troubling aspect of Buddhist texts who valorize being male. That women's bodies are seen as tied to the earth, tied to physical functions like feeding children. Men are seen as, in some ways, more pure. There are fewer dripping things from male bodies, so to speak. And so there is this genre of stories in which women, by this act of truth, magically their bodies transform into male. So while it's wonderful to hear a story of the Buddha in female form exhibiting compassion, there's also this sort of subtle discrimination that clearly still is saying it's better to have a male body than a female body. Coming on to another of these important religious figures in the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism is the figure of Tara. What's important about Tara is that she makes this vow that there are many who wish to achieve enlightenment in a man's body. And those stories about women transforming into men exemplify that. But she says in her vow, there are very few who wish to work for the enlightenment, the welfare of all beings in a female body. So she says, I vow to work only in a female body until all of the beings in this world have been brought to enlightenment. This is an image of Tara. This is her mantra. For Tibetans, she's probably one of the most important religious figures exemplifying compassion. I remember years ago when a friend and I were picking up a Tibetan monk from the airport and driving him through the streets of Charlottesville. There's this neighborhood safety sign in Charlottesville which shows a white palm with an eye in it, indicating that this is a place where neighborhood watches are operating. In the Buddhist tradition, there's a form of Tara, white Tara, and she has white hands, and in her white hands there is this eye. And this monk got so excited when he saw this neighborhood watch sign. And he said, Tara is here in your city. And he was so happy we didn't want to tell him otherwise. But that was the way he saw it, that white hand with the eye in it was the sign of the goddess Tara manifesting even in the city of Charlottesville. Okay. There are couples that work together. This is a tradition that Dominic knows a good deal more of than I do. This is the woman whose name is Maciek Lubdrum. We're not in the realm of fantasy anymore. She's a real individual, somebody who chose to follow the religious path. And her teacher is the guy on the top here, Padampa. One of the things she says is a beggar woman without a husband is happier than a wife with a bad husband. You get the sense her husband was not such a good fellow, so she chose to leave him and to establish a bond with Padampa. She's famous for, in her own right, for forming a lineage that persists to the present day. If you want to know more about this lineage, ask Dominic. But I think what I want to point out is that there are these deep, rewarding friendships between male and female practitioners where they mutually support one another. Okay, I'm going to go on into Zen. Again, you have another example here of a very important Zen religious teacher, Dogen, who's the founder of one important Zen tradition. And he's aware of the fact that sometimes nuns are not given the same amount of respect that monks are. And what he says to monks in his tradition, the monk who seeks the Dharma and studies Zen, if he comes across a woman in the assembly, he should bow to her in homage and ask her about the teaching. So there should be nothing untoward about seeking out a woman and asking her for her teachings. This is one of the first women to become recognized by a Japanese Zen teacher as his disciple and given the permission to teach. I've never actually talked to this woman. I saw her once when she was leading a group of students around the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya. And she looked very fierce and very resolute, and all of her students, male and female, were following behind her. I remember the last one because he was wearing these wonderful red high-top sneakers. It was sort of like he was the caboose, following her train. She was a woman who spoke her mind. She criticized some of the residential Zen centers she saw as being too tied in with a patriarchal, hierarchical structure. She said only immature people need this kind of hierarchy, this kind of protection. She also broke with some of the practices that she saw that were, in her mind, too forceful. Some of you, whether you may have seen films where the Zen teacher walks down holding this big stick. He sees somebody whose attention is flagged, maybe their shoulders bend forward, and then he gives them some rather serious whacks, on the shoulders. And a friend of mine went to study in one of these Zen monasteries, and he sort of came back to the U.S. rather discouraged. All he got out of that encounter was bruises. Decided, I'm done with Buddhism, I'm going to become a potter. Became a great potter, but that sort of turned his heart away from Buddhism. All right, here's one of these stories that characterizes the Zen tradition. You have a teacher and a student exchanging dialogue. It's a dialogue between Maureen Stewart and a little girl. And she's in Cambridge, her home, the telephone rings, and this 7-year-old girl on the other end asks this question: do the Buddhas wear toenail polish? I mean, who but a 7-year-old girl could think of a question like that? And Marie Stuart Roshi says, are you wearing nail polish? Yes, the little girl shouts and hangs up. The point of that story is the Buddha is the little girl. She has within her Buddha nature. And that little 7-year-old recognized it. Okay, Jan Willis. She's somebody I know relatively well. This is her teacher, Lama Yeshe, who was one of the first Tibetan monks to come to the United States in the 70s and to give teachings. I mean, he, as you can see from this photo, has a wonderful smile. He would smile and his whole face would light up. And she clearly formed a connection with him when she was an undergraduate studying abroad in Nepal. But what she also says about who she is that she has always been raised in the Baptist tradition. Her Christian identity is still very much part of her. And she says in her autobiography, Dreaming Me, which was really a good read, she says she was in one of these little planes. I don't know if you've been in these little planes. They're really tiny, and when a thunderstorm comes, you really do wonder if this is your last time on Earth. She says the oxygen mask dropped. She called on both her teacher, Lama Yeshe, and upon Jesus. And she fervently said, Christ Jesus, help us, bless me, all these people. And what she comes out of that experience realizing, she was about to die. And what was important to her was her Buddhist lineage. What was also important to her was her lineage being brought up in the Baptist tradition. She's a human being graced by eternal truths, espoused both by Baptists, both by the Christian tradition and by Buddhists. I love this. This is an important Buddhist teacher in the Tibetan tradition. He went to Vietnam and he noticed that there were Vietnamese nuns who were studying martial arts. And he thought, I want to bring this back to my nuns, to empower them. And so what he does is that he teaches, this is him here, he teaches all of his nuns in the martial arts. And what he says about this is that he's founded a nunnery because he found that too many women were being pigeonholed into only domestic roles. They didn't have an opportunity to study, particularly in these rural areas. And so he forms a nunnery where they can come and they can study. I mean, he says, women are considered secondary to men, even among Buddhist monks. This is unfair because they have a lot to contribute. And what the nuns themselves had said is this gives them confidence that they have the power to defend themselves physically. Another important figure in the Buddhist tradition is the Karmapa. One of my friends many years ago heard him speak, and he said at that time, you know, when I am older, he fled Tibet when he was, I think, 14. This was when he was in, I think, his early 20s. He said, when I am older and in a position of authority, I am going to see to it that the 4 pillars of the Buddhist tradition, monks, nuns, laymen, lay women, all of those pillars are established. In Tibet also, full ordination is not present. And he's working towards getting nuns in his tradition fully ordained. As of now, they can only take the novice initiation. This process has begun recently. He's invited nuns from China, Hong Kong, to come over and to give the nuns a set of precepts, begin this process of ordination, so they will be fully ordained. This will give them respect within the community, will give them the opportunity to teach. This is another part of the Tibetan tradition. The Dalai Lama himself, this is the first woman who was fully ordained in the tradition. She's German, Geshe Kelsang Wangbo. She studied for 15 years alongside the men, doing the same kinds of debating practices the men did, studying and memorizing the same texts. It's probably not surprising the first woman to do this was a Westerner. We, as Westerners, tend to be much more forthright about equality. But now this is open to women from all over the Tibetan cultural region, from Ladakh, from Spiti, from India. And here you see beginning class of Geshe-mas. And what this does also, it gives them the right to teach in their traditions. Instead of having to invite a monk from some neighboring monastery to come over and to teach the women, these women can do it themselves. And that gives them a great deal of strength. It's not just monks who are teaching. In many traditions within the broad Tibetan religious culture, there are also the notion of lay teachers. These two lay teachers, Anne Klein and Harvey Aronson, are people that I've known since 1976 when I first met them. And Anne has two identities. She is both a professor at Rice University in Houston, but she is also a religious teacher in her own right. And her husband, Harvey, also has two personalities. He's a Buddhist psychologist, has a therapeutic practice, and with his wife together, they both teach in this community. And this shows you that the really breadth of their community within Houston. And what this tradition says on its website is they're engaged in furthering the spiritual growth of their own community as Buddhists, but they're also bridging this tradition and reaching out to curious people everywhere. They have school children come in to learn about Buddhism. They are engaged in, right now in Houston, helping others rebuild their houses. Fortunately, their house was not damaged. The temple was not damaged, but lots of other people's houses were damaged. So one of the last things I saw on Anne's feed was all of them cleaning out some of the damage in other houses in Houston. So you don't have to be a nun or a monk to be a religious teacher. You can be a layperson as well. Other places where this tradition has gone, the first Buddhist university, Naropa University in Colorado in Boulder. It's accredited. It teaches traditional Buddhist subjects, teaches traditional Buddhist languages, but also it offers degrees in psychology, environmental studies, visual arts. Jack Kerouac was there at one time. Allen Ginsberg was there. Aside from this university where you see contemplative experience as part of the curriculum, students have the opportunity to meditate, to learn, to calm their minds. For people who want to pursue a religious path, they have this other institute, this abbey in Nova Scotia, where you see these individuals pursuing a more traditional monastic calling. That's it. Hopefully I've kept within the time limits.
Have a question or comment?
Yes.
Professor, I was wondering, what doesn't really make sense to me is the fact that whenever we look at like the Buddhist teachings about what carries over from life to life, there isn't a gender that carries over. So I guess I don't understand why there would be a separation between male and female, like a division like that, because the essence itself isn't male or female.
I mean, that's true. The tradition does say that men and women both have male and female characteristics within them. But nonetheless, I mean, you are a human being living in a human society, and culture influences how you move about in the world. And if you find yourself in a culture in which men are always on top, then that's going to become reflected even in the ways in which religious institutions operate. Most religious institutions are aware of the fact that there are some of these discrepancies between men and women's experiences. Some of them work actively to change this. In other traditions, women say, we don't really need men to give us permission to practice. Even in traditions where women are denied full ordination, they say, we have the ability to sit down on our meditative cushion and to meditate and to bring our minds to a state of calm, a state of peace, regardless of gender. And that's always been a path that's open to both men and women from the very beginning. The Buddha has always said is that it doesn't matter if you're male or female. You can become, through your efforts, listening to the teaching, practicing meditation, you can attain a state of peace. But moving in society, there are real differences. You know, yes?
So I'm just saying, but like what's the Buddhist outlook on this? Because
It's changing. I mean, the first time His Holiness the Dalai Lama was confronted with that, it was a question that had never really occurred to him. And I think it's a challenge to the tradition, because if you take the text on ordination literally, one of the things that is specified is if somebody becomes a nun or a woman, they have to be recognized as fully female or fully male. And that clearly could be a problem for somebody who's intersex or transgendered. I don't think they've really come to face with that problem. And they've only come face to face with dealing with gay and lesbian people because there are disciples and teachers among the American Buddhist community in particular who are out as gay or lesbian and teach and are empowered to teach. But the next real barrier is going to be dealing with somebody who is transgendered. As far as I know, that hasn't happened.
There's special language is an important point, right? You see a really strict gender binary in Buddhist scripture. But life on the ground, nature doesn't know binaries. Nature knows horizons and multiple expressions, and no doubt throughout the very long history of Buddhist monasticism, there have been intersex individuals who successfully took ordination and became, members. So what's interesting is at the theoretical level, there's this really intense, right? And it's very simplistic. There's either penises or vaginas, nothing. You have to pop nothing. You have to, but no one's actually, checking genitalia of any of my friends who wanted to get ordained. But you see it reflected in literature written by male elites or male elites, and reflecting all this kind of patriarchal sense.
Yes.
well, I'm just curious when you say the fully ordained, are they ordained men?
Talking about the ones who are writing these things.
What you were just talking about, you said they were ordained as well.
So certainly I think that probably throughout history, it's impossible to say one way or the other. My guess is, or my presumption is, that people have been ordained as either men or women who are intersex. And, you know, maybe if someone to use a later terminology, maybe if someone more femme or more butch, they might ordain one way or the other.
I think if your ordination was available in their tradition, because in the Theravada tradition, I mean, there was a big deal with the Western monks.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Within the last, I think it's been 8 years, maybe, or 5 years, where several nuns requested ordination, right? And I'm not, hopefully I'm not too in. And they went back to Thailand, and the monks, the administration said, no, we're not going to allow it. So
Yeah.
they left the road. Or they
And this problem has also been there in Australia. One of the Australian priests, he ordained women. The word of it got back to his forest monastery in Thailand, and they sort of excommunicated him. We're no longer going to be in communication with you.
Because there's a small nunnery of about Sacramento now, who classified as 4 nuns who did not read the road, but left tradition, said no.
Yeah. And I think that says something about Western Buddhism, is that we have to form our own traditions. You know, we cannot let ourselves be bound by what is operative in a conservative society like Thailand.
And within the Tibetan tradition, which has no full ordination, women who have wanted full ordination have simply gone to a tradition opposite and maintain their robes. And what you have within the Tibetan tradition, where they wear distinctive red robes as opposed to gray or red, you have red-robed women in a tradition that doesn't offer full ordination, who are themselves fully ordained by a tradition that does.
And it's really interesting. I was in Japan a couple of years ago, visiting and it just seems to be terrific is that even in those countries now, the monks of the tradition are beginning to understand that women really need
Yeah.
full, because they were even, in some traditions, they were not given full information, right? It was supposed to go back. But what I saw there was full support for nuns being fully educated there, and it's really great.
And you saw Karmapa,
Yeah.
right? When
Yeah.
Dalai Lama dies, Karmapa will be the most powerful Tibetan teacher in the world. And he's dead set on this. And he's also addressing intersexuality and gender fluidity, too, which I think is, he's the only Tibetan Lama that calls it cancer. And it's important because these are the living,
Yeah, it's the 21st century.
And that's what some of the nuns said. They said tradition is wonderful until it becomes oppressive.
Yeah.
And so that was, they really wanted to. Again, when religion is so deeply intertwined with a larger cultural tradition,
Yeah. Yeah, one of my good friends, who was one of the people that founded the Buddhist nuns tradition in India, Beth Snapper, who worked with the Dalai Lama's brother's wife, to set this up. She says, initially it was very hard for the nuns to really become confident. They were used to being second-class citizens. You would go to a religious ritual, men were in front, women were in the back. Gradually, they've really built up the confidence of these women by giving them an education, giving them the ability to read the same text as the men. Now they have, within the tradition at Dromling, they have geisha monks. So at least as far as educational levels, they are on par with the geishas, the male monastics. Now they're working towards full ordination. That hasn't come yet. But I think what the Karmapa has started, bringing in nuns from China who have a legitimate ordination lineage, and saying that it does not bother him that these nuns come from a slightly different lineage, to get them to train up. Once that starts rolling, other people will follow in its wake. But it takes a resolute person who has stature to put that in motion. And the fact that he is recognized as an incarnation. What is he? Is he 17th? Karmapa? Yeah. I mean, that gives him power beyond what other people have.
They also, these, I'm close to one of the women here who obtained the Deche degree. so Professor Lang's indicating the novelty of it by appending feminine suffix, ma, right? So it's a shema, which has never been seen before. But my friend who attained this degree, I was talking to her recently on social media, and she said, you can just call me Geshe.
Yeah.
No feminine suffix, which is, right, so this is the institutionalization of women as teachers just it either invites or breeds this kind of fierce confidence, and that's going to spread like wildfire.
She was the first in her class. One of the postcards that's going around shows her right in the front.
Yeah, so of the women that attained that degree, she was number one, and I
Yep.
met her 20 years ago when I was studying debate in monasteries, and she ruthlessly defeated me in debate every time she had the opportunity. And she's going to be a great teacher in the future.
Yeah.
Of the world.
What's so great about it is it's sort of setting a model for others and other religions of the United States, so that it's certainly not religion. There's still so much construction that you have to understand. So I think that
Yes.
I have a question for you. So you mentioned that, do I have this right, that the Thai Queen had put up some panels and dedicated them to women?
Exactly.
Was this the queen of the current royal family?
Um,
The wife of the king who just died?
yeah, the wife of the king who just died. She's still living.
Yeah, the reason I ask is that I think, I'm a historian of late medieval and early modern Europe,
Mm.
and gender is a big part of what I'm interested in. And I started a couple of years ago looking at the history of the Thai women's movement. And the queen and the crown princess and women in the royal household are very much invested in part of the, I don't think I'd go so far as to call it feminist,
Mm-hmm.
but of the women's movement.
Yeah.
That kind of terminated in the 1970s. And you mentioned that, I was like, there's something there, I don't know what it is, but you know, if we've got this queen who's supportive of the Thai women's movement,
Mm-hmm.
and she's kind of a patroness of Buddhist nuns. So you've given me something to think about. And so I was hoping
Yeah,
that
I mean,
this-
many people within Thailand hope that her eldest daughter would, in fact, have assumed the throne over her brother, who has gotten a reputation as a playboy. Can't say that in Thailand; it's put you in jail. But yeah, I've met the eldest daughter, and she is a very inspiring person. Yeah, she's a real individual. Yeah, she was giving a talk, and her ladies in waiting were in the back, and the phone rang, and none of the ladies in waiting would dare touch her phone. So she had to leave the podium, rush back, silence the phone herself. But she struck me as a real down-to-earth, sensible person. Yes?
You mentioned something that, you talked about the lineage with the Chinese nuns and stuff like that in lineage. Like, what is the importance of the lineage of the nuns? Because you really cover that. Like how does that play in?
Well, what they try to do is trace it all the way back to the founder. And this is certainly common in many religious traditions, is to be able to trace it right back to the beginning. I don't think that you can go through hundreds of years and come up with an exact list. But the notion is that one teacher passed this on to his disciple, or her disciple passed it on to another, and they've got the true teachings.
So could that mean like, could the Dalai Lama then, let's say the Dalai Lama now, give the lineage of authority to a nun, or does it have to come from another nun?
It has to come from another nun. I mean, the way the ordination ceremony works is that a nun has to be ordained by a group of 10 fully ordained nuns. And this has to be confirmed by a congregation of 10 fully ordained monks. And what has been lacking in the Tibetan tradition is there have not been 10 fully ordained Tibetan nuns. So what the Karmapa has done is he's importing fully ordained women from the Chinese tradition. And they are going to be the people who ordain this first group of women who get the higher ordination.
But that wouldn't necessarily
Yeah, they're going to import it into their own tradition.
You learn just how Buddhism was transmitted to different cultures, right? And it went a different route during different centuries, and you planted it in Tibet. So a different condition of ordination was determined. And since it was lost in Tibet, and there's not 10 fully ordained nuns to oversee the ordination of the new fully ordained nuns, Karmapa's our great master who's saying, actually, we don't need 10 ordained nuns in Tibet, we'll just get them to China.
Yeah,
Those ordained nuns are just as good as
and that's a radical idea.
because
But
we did
he's doing it. You know, he's no longer talking about it. A friend of mine who first heard him say that he was going to fully ordain nuns. I mean, she said she got shivers down her spine because she never thought she would hear that come out of the mouth of a Tibetan teacher. Dalai Lama's always talked, you know, kind of in an evasive way about it. He's got a lot of things on his plate. Fully ordaining Tibetan women was not one of the things he wanted to take on, so it's great that somebody has really made it his agenda.
I think we're about out of time. If we could just start.
Good.